Hi friends, today we're uncovering a secret. Picture this, a cold courtroom in Kilkenny, Ireland. The year is 1324. Candles flicker on stone walls. The air smells of damp wool and burning tallow. And at the center of it all, a woman, dressed in white, noble, stern, accused, not of witchcraft, not exactly, but of something far more dangerous in the eyes of the church. She healed. Her name was Alice Keitler, and history tried to forget her, not because she brewed potions or whispered prayers in Latin. No, Alice had the audacity to mix herbs that worked, to treat illness without a priest, to call disease what it was, and not the punishment of sin. And that terrified people more than the plague. So before you get comfortable, hit that like button and subscribe if you actually enjoy this kind of weird, haunted truth. And drop a comment. Tell me your city and what time it is where you are. Just so I know where in the world this shadow is falling. All right, get ready, because it only gets stranger from here. Let's wind the clock back. Ireland, early 14th century. A time of feudalism, famine, and fear. The church is in full control of the land, the people, the truth. And among the Anglo-Norman elite, there's a woman who stands apart, Alice. She's wealthy, educated, widowed, 4 times to be precise. Suspicious? Definitely. But none of her husbands died from daggers or poison. They died, slowly, in pain, under her roof. And that's what sparked it. Her last husband, Sir John Le Poer, was found writhing in his bed, foaming at the mouth. His last words, reportedly, were about a foul smell and a shadowed woman. The family priest suspected poison, but then things took a turn. Instead of the church stepping in quietly, a full trial erupted. And the charges? They weren't just about death. They were about healing, sorcery, necromancy. Alice, the court said, had used herbs, powders, and unknown ointments to enchant her husbands. Not to kill them, but to seduce them, to control their wills, to rob them of their souls. Her servant, Petronilla de Meath, was arrested and tortured, and what she confessed is where this story really begins. Because she said, under duress, that Alice was practicing forbidden medicine. Let me repeat that. Not murder, not demonology. Medicine. Now let's pause. Zoom out. The 1300s weren't friendly to women with knowledge. If you could read Latin and weren't wearing robes, that was suspicious enough. But mixing herbs, boiling roots, bleeding someone to reduce fever, that crossed a line. See, medieval Europe had rules. The body belonged to God. Healing it without divine sanction, that was theft. So Petronilla's confession laid out a chilling list. Potions made from dog fat, eyes of newt, yes, literally, and a certain unnameable powder wrapped in parchment with arcane symbols. But buried in the hysteria was something else. She said Alice studied texts from the East, likely medical manuscripts smuggled through Spain from Arabic scholars. If that's true, then Alice wasn't just a rich widow. She was part of something much bigger, a hidden medical underground. And here's where it gets even weirder. Because this trial, it wasn't local gossip. It became one of the earliest recorded witchcraft trials in Europe. And it was all built around the fear that a woman might know too much, that she could heal without prayer. Alice fled before the verdict was read. She vanished from history, likely escaping to England or Flanders. No body, no grave, no closure. But Petronilla, she burned. They stripped her, paraded her through town, tied her to a stake, lit the fire. And here's the part no one talks about. Dozens of women in Kilkenny vanished in the months that followed. Some went into hiding, some fled, some simply disappeared. as if the entire city had decided. Knowing anything about illness was now a death sentence. There's a drawing. Rare. Hidden in a 17th century manuscript in Trinity College. It shows a woman kneeling at a bedside, holding a vial. Her face is blank, no eyes, no mouth. She's faceless, erased. The title beneath, Moulière in Albo, 324. The woman in white. Historians don't agree if it's Alice. Some say it's metaphor. Some say it's fiction. But in the margins, someone scribbled in Latin, "She knew the cure, and that was her crime." Think about that. In an age where half of Europe would soon die from the plague, the greatest threat to power wasn't disease. It was knowledge, especially in the hands of the wrong people, especially if those people were women, especially if those women could cure things the church could only pray over. And this wasn't a one-off. Alice Keitler's case became a template. Over the next 300 years, women across Europe were burned not just for witchcraft, but for treating wounds, easing childbirth, stopping fevers. Their knowledge was rebranded as heresy, and we lost centuries of medical understanding because of it. Here's a detail that still haunts me. The records of the trial describe the inside of Alice's home, and one item stood out: a chest of dried plants, each labeled in Latin and Greek. This wasn't some witch's brew. This was an apothecary, carefully maintained, scientifically organized, and they destroyed it. Not because it was dangerous, but because it worked. Remember this name, Bald's Leech Book, an old English medical text rediscovered in the 19th century. One of its recipes for treating eye infections was tested by modern scientists in 2015, and it killed antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It worked better than penicillin in some cases. A 1,000-year-old recipe made of garlic, wine, and ox bile. Now think about how many other cures were lost when we burned the women who carried them. So when you hear about Alice Keitler, the witch, remember what she really was: a threat. Not to God, but to power. She knew how to heal. She shared that knowledge. And the men around her couldn't allow that. So they called it witchcraft, invented demons, and lit the match. But her story didn't die. It slipped into shadows, into whispers, into nameless drawings and half-torn pages in forgotten books. The woman in white never really left. She's still there, just out of frame, waiting. Let's step into a room. Stone walls, candle smoke, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams. The air is thick, not with perfume or incense, but with something sharp, something chemical. A stinging smell that hits the back of your throat and makes your eyes water. It's sulfur and blood. And if you're lucky, rosemary. This isn't a torture chamber. It's a medical lab, or at least what passed for one in 14th century Europe. And the man hunched over the bubbling pot? He might be a monk, or a self-taught alchemist, or, let's be honest, a total fraud with excellent charisma. But either way, he's about to hand someone a cure, or a curse. Because in the Middle Ages, medicine was chaos, and that's not an exaggeration. See, in modern times, we like to draw neat lines. Doctors are doctors, chemists are chemists, priests are priests. But back then, a physician could also be a theologian, an exorcist might also be a surgeon. A barber could crack your skull open to release the demons, and almost no one, absolutely no one, agreed on what the body even was. Was it a temple of God, a prison for the soul, a map of the planets, a sponge full of black bile? Depends on who you asked and what you paid. But one thing was clear. Whatever you were suffering from, someone somewhere would mix a potion for it. And those potions? Let's just say you didn't drink them for the taste. Let's talk ingredients. Ready? Human fat, taken from criminals' corpses, used for topical ointments to soften tumors. Mercury, boiled and diluted, used for rashes, fevers, and syphilis. Spoiler: it made everything worse. Sulfur, believed to dry the humors and cleanse rot. Mummy dust, actual ground-up mummified human remains, imported from Egypt and sold in pharmacies from Venice to London. Bat blood, used in love potions and fertility treatments. And of course, urine. Always urine. Drunk, smeared, analyzed. Preferably from a red-haired child at dawn. Do you feel healed yet? No? Well, now imagine you've paid 2 silver coins, a fortune, for a syrup made of rose oil, quicksilver, and ground pearls. You're dying of pneumonia, or plague, or heartbreak. And this syrup smells like burned hair and vinegar. But they tell you, this is what the Pope uses. So, you drink it. And maybe, just maybe, you get better. Or maybe it was never the potion that worked. But the belief, the ritual, the fear. Let's back up. How did we get here? Where did all this weird medicine actually come from? The truth is, Europe didn't invent most of it. They stole it. Or more precisely, inherited fragments of much older systems. Greek, Roman, Arabic, even Persian. Take Avicenna, or Ibn Sina. Persian polymath, 11th century. His book, The Canon of Medicine, was a goldmine of medical wisdom, precise, observational, even shockingly modern in places. And European monks, they translated it, they copied it, but they didn't understand all of it. So they improvised. And that's when things got smoky. Let me tell you about the alchemists. They weren't just trying to turn lead into gold. That's the cliché. The truth is, alchemy was proto-chemistry. Deeply mystical, yes, but also surprisingly practical. Alchemists created distillation methods. They experimented with acids. They learned how to preserve, extract, ferment, calcinate, filter. They called their mixtures elixirs, some to heal, some to transform, some to grant eternal life. And in the back rooms of monasteries and apothecaries, they passed around tiny bottles labeled with skulls, snakes, suns, and moons. One recipe, from a hidden lab in Prague, called for powdered emerald snake ash goat bile mixed in wine from the Rhine. It was supposed to reverse blindness. It didn't. But the man who sold it, he made enough money to disappear into legend. Let's not forget the flagellants. These were the roving bands of zealots who whipped themselves through the streets, believing plague and illness were punishment from God. But what's less known, some of them carried remedies, not scientific ones, but symbolic ones. Dried hands of infants, pages from psalms boiled into tea, crosses dipped in the blood of martyrs. It was medicine by terror. And for some, it worked, because the line between ritual and remedy was almost invisible. Here's something they never taught you in school. In the city of Salerno, Italy, around the 11th century, there was a medical school, one of the best in Europe. But underground, literally beneath the main school, there was a secret lab, a stone room, sealed. Inside were shelves of herbs, minerals, and bones, arranged not by disease, but by planetary alignment. Need to cure gout? You needed a salve, blessed under Mars, made from iron shavings and crushed lilies, applied during a blood moon. This was medical astrology. It wasn't fringe, it was standard practice. And some of those formulas? They were dangerously effective. There's even evidence that one ointment made of opium, honey, and crushed ivy could induce near-total numbness. In other words, medieval anesthesia. Let me tell you a quick story. In 1450, in a French village called Saint-Flour, a mysterious illness swept through. People described feeling pins under the skin, hallucinations, vomiting. The church called it demonic. But one local healer, unnamed in the records, treated patients with a black salve. The ingredients are lost, but of the 50 infected, 20 survived. That was unheard of. The Inquisition arrived 2 weeks later. The healer, burned, and the salve, destroyed. Let's come back to the smell. That sharp, acidic, metallic scent, that was the signature of medicine that worked. Because sulfur, vinegar, alcohol, garlic, they're antiseptics. Crude, yes, but powerful. And even the so-called charlatans sometimes hit on real pharmacology by accident. The problem? They didn't know why it worked, so they couldn't defend it. And the church, the state, they didn't like mysteries outside their control, so healing became heresy. Cures became curses. And medicine began to stink, not just from the sulfur, but from the fear. One final thing. There's a book, unmarked, undated, found in a wall in Lübeck, Germany in 1901. Its pages are filled with recipes, real ones. Some traced back to Arabic texts, others clearly local inventions. But there's one entry, smeared and barely legible. Elixir 9, to restore breath after drowning. It contains nothing you'd expect. Just crushed white lily vinegar blood from the ring finger of a virgin, and a whispered prayer. Not in Latin, but in Basque. No explanation. No instructions. Just a line beneath it. Do not use unless desperate. The lungs remember. We don't know what that means, but someone once believed it could bring the dead back. And in a world where healing was dangerous, that belief might have been enough. Where does it hurt? The liver? Then you've sinned. You wake up in a damp bed, soaked in sweat. Your mouth is dry, your skin is burning, and somewhere deep in your chest, a throb, steady and sharp, like a knife left too long in the fire. You're not sure what's happening, but someone is. A man in robes enters your home. He's not a doctor. He's a confessor. And the first question he asks isn't about your pain, your pulse, or your symptoms. He asks, "What sin did you commit before this started? Welcome to the medieval diagnosis." In the world of medieval Europe, your soul was the user manual for your body. There were no X-rays, no blood tests, no bacterial cultures. There was only divine cause and effect. Your liver hurts? You're greedy. Lungs, pride bowels, lust. And that headache that won't go away? Someone, maybe you, made God angry. Let's backtrack. Because this didn't come from nowhere. It started with Galen, the ancient Roman physician who died in 200 AD but still somehow managed to rule medicine for the next 1,500 years. Galen's theory of the four humors was simple, deceptively simple. The body is made of four fluids: blood, warm and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; black bile, cold and dry; yellow bile, warm and dry. Too much of one, you're unbalanced. That imbalance, it doesn't just make you sick. It changes your personality, your fate, your moral standing. So when you walk into a medieval clinic, which might be a monastery, a wooden shack, or someone's kitchen, you're not being asked what hurts, you're being judged. Let's say you're melancholic, sad withdrawn. The diagnosis? Too much black bile treatment, leeches, boiled cabbage, and prayer. Now let's say you're too happy, laughing, drinking, singing songs that offend the local bishop. The diagnosis? Too much blood. You're too sanguine. Treatment? Bloodletting, of course. Maybe through a vein in your forearm, or maybe through the temple, if they want to get dramatic. Because that's how you brought the body back into balance. Take something out. But underneath all this was a more sinister idea. that your morality caused your illness. If you were sick, something was wrong with your soul. You'd sinned, or someone in your family had. And now your liver was paying the price. In some churches, especially in Germany and northern France, they even painted medical confessionals. You'd sit inside, not to confess your thoughts, but your symptoms, and the priest would interpret them like signs in the sky: chronic cough, pride, stomach cramps, gluttony, inability to sleep, envy, or lust, paralysis. The devil, literally, not figuratively. And yes, sometimes the prescription was not medicine, but exorcism. Let's talk about St. Vitus's dance, a real phenomenon. Still studied today. People, often women, would suddenly begin to twitch, spin, laugh uncontrollably, collapse. Sometimes entire crowds would join them. It looked like mass hysteria. But in the Middle Ages, it was possession. Doctors didn't study their brains. They burned incense, sprinkled holy water, dragged them to shrines. One woman was said to be cured after being forced to sleep beside the bones of a martyred nun. Another was buried alive, not as punishment, as a mercy, because no medicine could cure a soul touched by Satan. Now here's where it gets even more twisted. We tend to think of medieval medicine as cruel, and it was. But it wasn't just brutality. It was belief weaponized. Imagine this. Your child is sick, burning up, shaking, and the priest says, "This is punishment. You must confess your sins publicly. Strip your clothes. Walk barefoot to the church. Whip yourself. Beg forgiveness." And you do. And your child dies anyway. You're not just grieving now, you're guilty. That's the real sickness. Not the fever, not the flu, the shame, the way the system told people they deserved their suffering. In England, around 1380, a woman named Margery Kempe became violently ill after childbirth. She suffered what we would now call postpartum psychosis. Hallucinations, terror, uncontrollable sobbing. But there were no psychiatrists, only priests. They told her it was punishment for lustful thoughts, that God had infected her mind. So she tried to drown herself. She failed. But what's shocking is that Margery survived and wrote about it. Hers is one of the first English-language autobiographies we have. And in it, she describes how her healing didn't come from confession. It came from speaking, from reclaiming her voice, from breaking out of the mold that said, "A woman's body is a map of her sin." But Margery was the exception. Most women like her, buried in silence. Let's talk about the liver letter. It was a real document, circulated among clergy in the late 1200s, found in the Vatican archives, translated only recently. It was essentially a guide. Which organ hurts? Which sin caused it? Which penance to perform? A cheat sheet. Here are some actual entries. Liver pain? Greed. Fast for 7 days. Donate 10% of income. Chest tightness? Pride. Kneel on stone for 2 hours daily. Kidney pain? Lust. Wash in cold water before dawn? Chronic fatigue. Sloth. No rest on Sundays. Manual labor required. This wasn't fringe theology. This was standard diagnosis. And if you didn't improve, they just told you your sin was worse than you admitted. Now imagine the terror of a real illness. A tumor. A heart attack. A stroke. But instead of treatment, you're handed a rope, told to crawl through town on your knees, begging forgiveness, while your body rots from the inside. That was medicine. That was justice. That was God's will, or so they said. One last detail. In the ruins of a monastery in southern France, archaeologists found a fresco, faded, almost gone, but you can still make out the image. A man lying on a bed, surrounded by dark clouds. From each organ, liver, heart, stomach, a little demon is crawling out. One is whispering, one is biting, one is writing on parchment. At the foot of the bed stands a monk holding a mirror, not to reflect light, but to show the man his own face. Below the painting, in Latin, "He who knows not his sin cannot know his cure." Imagine growing up with that on the wall. And yet, here's the final twist. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes a confession lifted something, a fever broke. A cough stopped. Was it psychosomatic? Coincidence? Luck? Or something else? Because in a world without microscopes, without antibiotics, without logic, belief was the most powerful drug they had. Scalpel and crucifix. The body lay still, arms folded across the chest, skin pale as wax, lips stitched shut. Around him, silence, except for the slow drip of melted candle wax, the shuffle of robes, the creak of leather gloves tightening. And then, the first cut. This wasn't a morgue. It was a monastery. And the man holding the knife? He wasn't just a surgeon. He was a heretic. Let's be very clear. For most of the Middle Ages, cutting open the human body was illegal, not frowned upon, not discouraged. Forbidden. Why? Because the body wasn't yours to open. It belonged to God. To dissect a corpse was to violate the sacred vessel. Worse, to imply that there was something mechanical about the soul's home. That maybe the flesh wasn't divine. That maybe the truth about disease and death didn't live in heaven, but right here, beneath the skin. And that was blasphemy. But let's rewind. Because despite the ban, dissection still happened. In the shadows. By candlelight, on criminals' bodies, stolen from gallows or graves. In back rooms of abbeys. In cellars beneath universities. And the people who did them, they weren't ghouls. They were pioneers. Often monks, sometimes women. Sometimes traveling doctors with more courage than credentials. They didn't just want to cut. They wanted to understand. But the church wasn't impressed. In 1299, Pope Boniface VIII issued an edict, no more cutting. Specifically, no more boiling and dismembering of the dead for study or travel. The edict wasn't just about autopsy. It was also aimed at a gruesome practice, boiling the bodies of nobles so their bones could be transported clean across Europe. Still, the message was clear. Do not touch what is divine. But behind the curtain, pressure was building. Because disease didn't care about dogma, and by the 1300s the plague was devouring Europe. Suddenly people wanted answers. Not prayers, not penance. Anatomy. Let's talk about one man, Mondino de Luzzi. In 1315 in Bologna, he performed one of the first sanctioned dissections in centuries. Official.public. On a female body, probably an executed criminal. It was a spectacle. Students crowded into the anatomy theater, a literal theater, with wooden stands, benches, and a raised platform, like a stage. Mondino stood at the center, scalpel in hand. A priest watched from the side, just in case God wanted to object. And what Mondino discovered was horrifying, because the inside of the body didn't match Galen. The lungs were the wrong shape. The liver had the wrong number of lobes. The heart, the sacred heart, wasn't the seat of emotion. It was a muscle. Galen had never dissected a human, only apes. So his writings, still considered gospel in medical schools, were riddled with errors. But to say that out loud could get you killed. So dissections continued, but in secret. In Paris, under Notre Dame, a network of tunnels was used to move bodies between river barges and university cellars. Candles marked the walls in chalk. Each dissection was timed, no longer than 6 hours before rot set in. In Padua, corpses were dissected in winter only. Cold preserved the organs. Some professors even used snow to keep bodies usable longer, stuffing it into the torso like packing foam. And in Prague, a whispering group of monks, known as the Order of the Bone, were said to perform illegal autopsies, recording their findings in code hidden in hymnals. Their motto? Truth through flesh. Here's a strange twist. Even as the church banned dissection, it also commissioned paintings of saints with their insides exposed, Saint Bartholomew, flayed, smiling, holding his own skin, Saint Erasmus, intestines unspooling from his belly like ribbon. These weren't horror. They were devotion. The idea that suffering revealed the soul, but if you opened a dead body to reveal a tumor instead of a demon, that was witchcraft. Sometimes the surgeons were women. Yes, women. Midwives, mostly, forced to deal with anatomy because no one else would touch childbirth. There's one story, whispered, never confirmed, about a woman named Isabeau in 14th century Lyon. She allegedly performed a cesarean on a dying mother. Not to save the baby, but to understand why she had died. The baby was already gone. She cut, documented, drew what she saw. That drawing, charcoal on vellum, resurfaced in a private collection in 1921. A uterus, open like a fruit, labeled in Latin, signed only with a symbol, the ancient symbol for woman and surgeon. We don't know who she was, but we know what she did, and it wasn't legal. Let's not romanticize this too much. These early anatomists weren't saints. Some mutilated bodies beyond recognition. Some were frauds. One physician in Rouen claimed to have found a fifth ventricle of the heart, which turned out to be a grape he dropped during dissection. But others, they changed the world. By 1400, detailed drawings of organs began to circulate in universities, anonymously, to avoid trouble. Livers, stomachs, intestines, all copied and recopied. And soon, young surgeons began challenging the books, saying, "This isn't what I saw in the cadaver." Imagine that, a student correcting a sainted physician. That was revolution. But not everyone celebrated. There's a record from 1433 of a student named Thomas, who performed a dissection in secret and was excommunicated. His notes, found centuries later in Oxford, include a chilling line: "The body is not sacred. The body is a question." He vanished shortly after. No grave, no mention in church records. But one of his drawings, a heart, anatomically correct, is still scratched into a stone wall at Merton College. Small, precise, hidden behind a bookshelf. Now let's go deeper, because some believed that dissection wasn't just medical, it was magical. In Prague, a rumored group of anatomists turned occultists called the Corpus Circle believed that the body's organs corresponded to the planets, that opening the stomach could release a curse, that the liver stored ancestral sin. They didn't just dissect, they performed rituals as they did it. Candles lit in planetary alignments. Incantations whispered over open ribs. Was it science? Was it madness? We'll never know. Their lab was sealed by the city guard in 1492. When it was opened, centuries later, all they found were bones and one word scrawled in dried blood on the wall: intra, Latin for enter. Here's the paradox. The church said, the body is sacred. The early surgeons said, the body is a puzzle. And sometimes it was both, because to cut was to ask questions. And to ask questions, in a time of unquestioned faith, was dangerous. But without those questions, we would never have known the truth, that the liver is not the seat of greed, that the heart is not pride, that pain has reasons deeper than sin, and that salvation sometimes starts with a scalpel. Forgotten anatomists. The women medicine tried to erase. Imagine a parchment, faded, yellowed, water-stained. The ink has bled at the edges, but the sketch is still clear. A uterus, drawn in ink and soot, labeled in Latin, precise, anatomically correct. Now imagine the signature underneath. Not a name, just Maria, who is not allowed. We've been lied to. You've been taught that the history of medicine was written by bearded men in robes, holding scalpels and scrolls. That women were midwives, useful, yes, but barely educated, always supervised, peripheral. But go deeper into the archives, into the private notebooks, into the margins of the margins, and you start to see a different truth. A hidden network of women who didn't just treat fevers and deliver babies. They studied the body, cut it open, wrote down what they saw, taught others, and were promptly erased, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. Let's start with Trotula of Salerno. She wasn't a myth, she was real. An 11th century physician from the medical school at Salerno, yes, the same one with the secret labs. Trotula wrote one of the first major medical texts on women's health in Europe, De Passionibus Mulierum, on the diseases of women. It was clear, specific, and full of observations that no male doctor had ever dared write. She described menstruation, vaginal infections, the use of opiates during childbirth. She recommended warm compresses for postpartum pain. She knew how to turn a breech baby. Let me repeat that. In the 11th century, she described procedures we still use today. And yet, for centuries, her name was slowly edited out. By the 1400s, most medical manuscripts had changed her name to Eros, Trotus, or just listed Anonymous. Some historians even claimed she was a fictional construct, a literary device, not a real person. But we have records. We have student notes referencing Magistra Trotula. We have receipts from women in Naples paying to be treated by the lady doctor. We have her fingerprints. And still, medicine turned the page. Let's go further. In 1361, a woman named Jacoba Felicie stood trial in Paris. Her crime? Practicing medicine without a license. Not killing, not harming, not scamming. In fact, most of her patients testified that she helped them when male doctors failed. But the court ruled, though she is skilled and learned, she is a woman and she must not cure. She was banned, stripped of her tools, watched for years. Her writings? Destroyed. Her name? Almost forgotten. Almost. There's a recurring symbol in many early European anatomical drawings. A small flower, usually hidden in the corner. A chamomile bloom. It shows up again and again in private sketchbooks, often beside diagrams of female anatomy. Some researchers now believe this was a secret watermark, used by women to identify their work to each other, without being discovered. Think about that. A network of anatomists and healers, passing drawings and notes like contraband, using botanical code in the margins, teaching each other not in universities, but in bedrooms, kitchens, graveyards. This wasn't amateur hour. This was resistance. Here's something they never told you. In the city of Bologna, in the 14th century, there were female professors of anatomy. Yes, professors. One of them was Alessandra Giuliani. She worked in the anatomy theaters. She developed techniques for preserving organs using colored wax, injecting red into arteries, blue into veins, creating some of the earliest known vascular maps in Europe. She died young, possibly of infection, possibly of something darker. After her death, her records were removed. Her laboratory passed to a male assistant. He took credit for her technique. For centuries, her name was known only through a single surviving inscription, in memory of Alessandra, who saw what others would not look at. A whisper, barely a ghost. Let's pause. Why erase them? Why silence women who clearly knew medicine, who observed, documented, healed? Because knowledge, in the wrong hands, is dangerous. And in the Middle Ages, women's hands were always considered the wrong ones. To know anatomy was to know secrets. Where the womb hides, how pain moves, where life begins. If a woman understood those things, she didn't need a priest to explain them. She didn't need a husband to speak for her. She didn't need permission. And that, in a society built on control, was unacceptable. A 15th century manuscript from Rouen contains an anonymous drawing of the female reproductive system. Accurate. Labeled in Greek. Far ahead of its time. Next to it, someone, probably a monk, has written in furious Latin, "This was not drawn by a man. Burn it." It wasn't burned. It was hidden in the back of the binding. That's how it survived. Tucked behind the spine of a different book, one about gardening. We only found it 500 years later. Let's talk about the Midwives' Book. Written in England, mid-1600s, by Jane Sharp, a practicing midwife who had studied medicine for over 30 years. She described cesareans, uterine inversion, hemorrhage control. She criticized male surgeons for being brutal and careless. The book sold well, but was later reissued anonymously and eventually attributed to a male translator. Today, few medical schools teach it, but her observations were centuries ahead. She knew about preeclampsia. She knew about pelvic tilt. She even described symptoms that resemble modern endometriosis. We knew. She knew. And we forgot, on purpose. And now, modern historians are finding more. In apothecary records, in shipping manifests, in letters between abbesses, snippets of notes like, "The root boiled twice and strained eased the swelling. Anna applied the poultice after dark. Do not write this down where men can find it." Women, healers, surgeons, pharmacists. The problem wasn't that they didn't exist. The problem is that we deleted them. Final story. In the ruins of a convent outside Seville, a sealed trunk was found in 1997. Inside cloth scraps, dried herbs, surgical tools, and a book. No title. Just pages and pages of anatomical drawings. Some were delicate, others were gruesomely detailed. There were notes about wound stitching, eye diseases, nerve damage, birthing positions, all written in a tight, slanted hand. The last page contained no drawing, just a line. In Spanish, "We learned in silence, but the body spoke anyway. So next time someone tells you that the great minds of medicine were all men in dark cloaks, holding scalpels and smoking pipes, remember Maria, who wasn't allowed. Remember Jacoba, forbidden but not broken. Remember the chamomile flower in the corner of a blood-stained page. And ask, how much healing have we lost, simply because we wouldn't let women speak? Witch's eye? Thief's tooth? Heretic's liver? A jar of teeth? A mummified hand? A book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin, though no one dared confirm it. These weren't trophies. They were tools. Welcome to the side of medieval medicine they don't talk about in textbooks. Because once you lift the veil of church-sanctioned ointments and monk-approved leeching, you fall headfirst into a world where superstition was science, and the macabre was just another Tuesday. This wasn't a bug in the system. This was the system. Let's talk about what doctors really believed and what they were willing to do to keep their patients and themselves alive. There's a line from a 13th century physician's notebook in Prague. The eye of a witch, crushed with wine, shall drive fever from the blood, but only if the witch has confessed. Read that again. Not the spell of a village lunatic, not the scribble of a demonologist. A doctor wrote that, a respected one. See, in the medieval mind, healing wasn't just about the body. It was about purity. If you were sick, something had gone wrong, not just in your flesh, but in your soul. Maybe you sinned. Maybe your neighbor cursed you. Maybe the stars misaligned. So what's the cure? Something opposite of you. Something more sinful, more twisted, more broken. In short, something dark. Let's start with the thief's tooth. It shows up in over 40 different folk medical recipes between the 11th and 15th centuries. Used to treat nightmares, toothaches, yes, irony, convulsions in children, wandering womb. We'll get to that demonic possession, naturally. But not just any thief would do. It had to be a hanged man's tooth, extracted after death, before burial, and ideally under a full moon. Some recipes called for grinding it into powder. Others said to press it under the tongue. A few texts claim sucking on the whole tooth while reciting prayers could draw out fevers. The belief that criminals carried a residue of chaos, and chaos could cancel out other kinds of sickness. Of course, no one stopped to ask why your healer had a jar of dead men's molars. Then there's the liver of a heretic. This one was rare, partly because heretics weren't exactly left lying around. But in times of plague, war, or unexplained madness, some fringe apothecaries swore by it. According to a 14th century tract from Aragon, a liver blackened by sin shall blacken death itself. Dry it. Burn it. Inhale the smoke for strength against the rot. There are no surviving testimonies of this working. There are, however, records of inquisitors confiscating what they called necromedical powders from certain physicians of the back streets. And you begin to wonder, were these healers or cultists wearing white coats? Of course, the wandering womb deserves its own paragraph. Doctors believed a woman's uterus wasn't fixed. It moved like a lost animal inside her body, causing choking, hysteria, even blindness. So how did they fix it? By luring it back into place. They'd burn foul herbs, sulfur, resin, even burned hair, near the mouth or nose. Then place sweet oils or roses between the thighs. The womb, like a confused creature, would smell the sweetness and travel back down. In short, they were baiting the uterus. This wasn't fringe science. This was mainstream medieval gynecology. And the worst part? It actually stayed in medical texts for centuries. Now let's talk about witch parts. Europe was obsessed with witches, but not just to burn them. They also believed witches held power, and that their body parts could be repurposed for healing or sometimes for hexing. Witch's eye, used in fever tonics. Witch's hair, burned to stop epilepsy. Witch's blood, smeared over doorways to prevent stillbirth. Grim? Absolutely. Effective? Probably not. But the belief was so strong that some physicians traveled with parts they claimed were taken from witches. Small pouches of dried tissue, or vials of blood allegedly taken at confession. Of course, most were fake. But the idea? That the darker the source, the stronger the cure. And then there's corpse medicine. Yes, you read that right. It was called mumia, and for a while it was fashionable. The name came from the Arabic word for bitumen, the resin used in mummification. But Europeans misunderstood the word. They thought it meant the mummy itself. So they started grinding up actual mummies and putting the powder into medicine. Royalty drank it, doctors prescribed it, apothecaries sold it, sometimes labeled as man's flesh. King Francis I of France carried mummy powder in a pouch around his neck. Queen Elizabeth, I was said to have taken it when she was ill, and it wasn't just ancient Egyptian mummies. When supplies ran low, grave robbing became a legitimate part of the medical economy. That strange dust in the tonic, it might have been someone's grandfather. But let's pause a moment. It's easy to laugh now, to cringe, to call it madness. But remember, they were desperate. They had no germ theory, no anesthesia, no real understanding of infection, immunity, bacteria. So they reached for what they did understand. Symbolism, reversal, balance, punishment, purity, sin, to treat poison, use poison, to expel evil, consume a fragment of it, to heal the body, terrorize the soul. Sound backward? Sure. But don't forget, even today, we give patients radiation to kill cancer. We take viruses, weaken them, and inject them as vaccines. We call it science now. But once, it was ritual. One final story. In 1496, in a village near Cologne, a boy was sick. High fever, convulsions, screaming in Latin, though his parents swore he never learned it. The local doctor was called. He arrived with a strange bundle. Inside it, a dried frog's heart, a silver coin, and a strip of parchment with blood on it. He placed the coin under the boy's tongue, tied the frog heart to his chest, burned the parchment and chanted. The boy lived. Recovered completely within a week. Coincidence? Placebo? Or something else? Years later, that same doctor disappeared during an Inquisition raid. They found his workshop. Inside, dozens of jars, each labeled with a sin. One was marked, liver of the unforgiven. So next time someone says, medicine is science, not magic, remind them, there was a time when the line between the two wasn't blurry. It didn't exist at all. And maybe, just maybe, some of those old shadows still cling to the edges of modern hospitals, in the dark corners of the morgue, in the forgotten rituals of the ER, in the medicine that works, even though no one knows why. The body remembers, and the past is never truly buried. The Pope's secret, remedies, a silver chalice, a drop of ambergris, a tincture aged for 7 years in glass sealed with wax from a candle burned at Easter Mass. This wasn't wine. It was medicine. And it was never meant for you. Because while peasants were bleeding themselves with leeches and rubbing onion paste into open wounds, the Vatican had its own pharmacy, its own recipes, its own rules, and somewhere, behind locked doors in thick leather-bound ledgers, they kept the cures no one else was allowed to use. Let's get one thing straight. The Church wasn't anti-medicine. It was anti-unauthorized medicine. And when it came to treating the Pope, or a cardinal, or an archbishop with a well-lined purse, suddenly the rules changed. Suddenly what was heresy in the streets became holiness behind marble doors. Distillations, infusions, extracts of herbs banned for witchcraft elsewhere, even the bodies of saints used as living pharmacies. You think that's a metaphor? Let's dig in. Start with Pope Clement VI, the man who ruled during the height of the Black Death. In public, he ordered prayers, penitence, processions. In private, he lived sealed inside a palace, his air filtered through burning herbs and walls soaked with vinegar. His physician, Guy de Chauliac, was one of the most respected surgeons of the 14th century. He described treatments that involved ground emeralds mixed with rose oil, candied gold leaf dissolved in wine, a salve made of myrrh, camphor, and unicorn horn, though historians suspect it was actually narwhal. This wasn't medieval folk medicine. This was elite pharmaceutical alchemy, and it was jealously guarded. Fast forward to the early 1500s. A manuscript appears in the Vatican Library, Liber Medicinarum Secretarum, the Book of Secret Medicines. No known author, only 2 copies, stamped with the papal seal. Inside, formulas. Not prayers, not rituals, not divine metaphors. Real, chemical formulas. One chapter describes a method for distilling antimony, a toxic metal, into a stable compound for treating melancholy of the heart. Another talks about suspending powdered rubies in honey to create a tonic that opens the mind to divine clarity. Some of these mixtures include arsenic, mercury, and opium, all known poisons, all used carefully, precisely, to treat the most powerful men in Christendom. None of this was ever meant to leave the archives, but a few pages did, and what they describe is medicine centuries ahead of its time. Let's talk about the Apostolic Pharmacy, founded in 1277. Still exists today, tucked inside Vatican City, behind guarded gates. It was and remains a pharmacy only for the clergy. Back in the Middle Ages, it was run by Jesuit alchemists, and they didn't just hand out cough syrup. They harvested plants grown in secret gardens. They ground powders under the full moon. They kept vials labeled not with Latin, but with symbols: a sun for energizing tonics, a cross for painkillers, an eye for vision-expanding substances. Yes, psychoactives, used not for fun, but for revelation. Some formulas were passed down orally, others were written in code, and when popes died, their personal recipes were often buried with them or burned. There's one case that's too strange to ignore. Pope Leo X, early 1500s. A Medici, a man of science and secrets. His private physician, a shadowy figure named Matteo Sereno, allegedly developed a tonic made from crushed pearls, deer musk, saffron, and human placenta. It was used to restore balance to the blood and increase divine lucidity. The Vatican denies it, but a recipe matching that description appeared in a private collection in Florence in the 1800s, along with a note, "Given unto His Holiness in times of fog." Fog, a polite term for mental collapse, or hallucination, or possession? We don't know, but we know this. That same formula was found again, in fragments, inside the walls of a convent outside Naples, hidden in a jar, sealed in wax, labeled Vinum Lucis, wine of light. Now let's talk about the Holy Finger. In Avignon, during the 14th century, a bishop's diary describes a relic, a finger of St. Lawrence, kept in a silver box. It wasn't just for display. The diary claims the relic was dipped in oil to make the unction of clarity and applied to the brows of the dying. The oil supposedly reduced pain, induced peace. Some claim it caused visions. If this sounds ridiculous, remember morphine is derived from poppy resin. What if the clarity wasn't divine but chemical? And what else were they anointing? There's a room beneath the Vatican Library, not open to the public, known only through mentions in letters between monks. They called it Camera Obscura, Sanguinis, the hidden room of blood. No photographs, no inventory, but one 15th century letter describes it as containing the distillations of saints and sinners alike, preserved in glass, for study and for grace. Blood samples, ointments, poisons, no one knows. But one monk wrote, "To stand among the shelves is to feel watched by the flesh itself. The air is still, yet presses in, as if it remembers pain." You don't write that about wine bottles. Why does this matter? Because the Church spent centuries condemning healers for using herbs, oils, stones, potions, And yet, in its highest circles, it did the same. It just called them sacraments, or blessings, or divine gifts, mixed quietly in apothecary drawers lined with velvet. One last thread. In 1973, an archivist found an unmarked ledger in the Vatican's restricted stacks. Inside, inventory lists from the 1400s. One page stood out, a section titled, "For use only in desperation." No explanations, just ingredients: powdered horn of a white stag, tears of a nun collected during midnight vigil, hair of the penitent, black rose petals dried in silence, oil of sainted bone. And this final line, 1 drop to break the veil, 2, never. It's the only known mention of that formula. The recipe ends there. The rest of the page is torn away. So next time you hear that the church condemned witchcraft, alchemy, secret potions, ask yourself, was it morality or monopoly? Because while peasants begged in plague-ridden streets behind Vatican walls, they were bottling miracles. In silence, in gold, and in secrecy that still hasn't been fully broken. Wine, vinegar, and iron. How they treated the plague. A man walks down the street wearing a mask shaped like a bird's skull. Inside the beak, crushed herbs, mint, rose petals, and vinegar-soaked cloth. He's not a monster. He's a doctor. And the air around him, it smells like rot, fear, and failure. Because in 1348, Europe started dying. Fast. And no one knew what to do. Let's set the scene. The Black Death bubonic plague. It hit like lightning. People were healthy at dawn, dead by nightfall, boils the size of eggs, bleeding from the mouth, blackened limbs. Entire villages gone in a week. You could sneeze and seal your neighbor's fate. And into this horror walked the physicians with no understanding of bacteria, no concept of infection, just robes, masks, and guesswork. So what did they do? They turned to what they had always done: fire, blood, smoke, stone, and prayer. But also, they got creative and desperate, because when the plague knocked, it didn't ask for credentials. First, wine. Wine was sacred. It was used in communion, in celebration, and suddenly in medicine. Doctors prescribed it for everything: to wash wounds, to rinse the throat, to calm the nerves, to cleanse the air by boiling it with herbs, even to bathe in, if you could afford it. There are records of nobles soaking their linens in red wine, convinced it would repel the disease. Others drank burning wine, a mixture of alcohol and spices set on fire, cooled, and swallowed. They called it a fiery mercy. Did it work? Unclear. But it made people feel something, and when death was knocking, something was better than nothing. Second, vinegar. It was the hand sanitizer of the 14th century. Mixed with water, it was splashed on floors, burned in basins, used to rinse mouths. In some cities, vinegar fountains were erected for the public, literally spouting sour water people could use to cleanse themselves. But the most famous? The Four Thieves' vinegar. According to legend, during one outbreak in Marseille, a gang of thieves robbed plague victims and never got sick. When caught, they cut a deal. Tell us your secret, and we'll spare your lives. Their answer? A mix of vinegar garlic, wormwood cloves, rosemary lavender mint, and sometimes camphor or rue. They doused themselves in it, drank it, slept with it under their noses. It became legend. Even today, you can buy versions of it online. But did it work? Maybe. Some ingredients do have antimicrobial properties, garlic, vinegar, clove oil. But mostly, it smelled strong, and that made people feel protected. In a world where air was thought to carry disease, they wanted something that fought the air. Then there was iron, not as a weapon, but as a treatment. Some physicians believed the plague was caused by corrupted blood, and iron, the metal of Mars, could purify it. So they did things like heating iron rods and placing them near plague sores, drinking powdered rust dissolved in wine, pressing iron coins into boils, wearing iron pendants over the heart. The theory? Iron would draw out the bad humors, or protect the soul, or magnetize the miasma away. It made no sense. But neither did death at this scale. And people will believe anything when the grave is already half dug. Now let's talk about plague doctors. Yes, the beaked ones. They wore long waxed coats, gloves, canes, and those infamous masks. But here's the twist. The beak wasn't just for drama. It was functional. They stuffed it with herbs, spices, vinegar-soaked cloth, and even crushed juniper berries. The idea: filter the air, cleanse the breath, keep the death smell out. The mask acted like a crude respirator. Primitive? Yes. But ironically, it helped. Not because it blocked bacteria, they didn't know bacteria existed, but because it reduced exposure. Plague doctors weren't effective, but they were less likely to die than others, which in 1348 was practically a miracle. Let's not forget fire. Cities burned barrels of herbs in the streets: thyme, sage, wormwood. Smoke was believed to push out the plague. In Avignon, they burned 100 fires a night during the outbreak. The Pope had 6 constantly burning around his chambers. And for the poor, they were told to burn their clothes, their bedding, even their homes. One man in London reportedly lit his own roof on fire to purge the spirits. He was arrested. But his neighbors, none of them got sick. Coincidence? Maybe. But the rumor stuck. Sometimes the cures got darker. Some texts suggest cutting open the buboes and pouring in vinegar, hot oil, mercury, or even the blood of a black chicken. Yes, a chicken. There was a belief that the disease could be transferred from the human body to the flesh of another creature. So healers would press a plucked chicken against the sores. Wait, remove it, kill the bird. If the chicken looked sick, the cure was working. If it died, try another. It was medicine as ritual theater. Gruesome, cruel. But again, what else did they have? In some places, urine was used, collected, boiled, mixed with rosewater. Doctors called it a distillation of the self. It was believed that re-exposing the body to its own fluids might rebalance the inner humors. The logic: if you're dying, use everything, even what you already flushed away. Then there were the flagellants, bands of men marching from town to town, whipping themselves bloody. They believed the plague was a punishment for sin, and by showing suffering, they could earn forgiveness for everyone. Their rituals were a mixture of mass psychosis, spirituality, and physical collapse. Sometimes people dropped dead mid-procession. Others collapsed from infection, not plague, but their own wounds. Still, they spread. So did the disease. There's a chilling document in the archives of Lübeck, a diary from a physician named Heinrich von Kottmar. He writes, "I have burned my robes, I have buried my tools, I have drunk my own blood mixed with iron, and yet still they die. I am become ash inside a man." That was his last entry. No record of his burial. Just a single note written by someone else. His house burned. No plague in that street after. And here's the kicker. Some of these things worked. Not because of divine intervention, not because of balance, but by accident. Vinegar? A mild antiseptic, garlic? A natural antibiotic, smoke? Drives away rats, beaked masks, filtered droplets, boiled wine, killed bacteria in water. They didn't know why. But sometimes survival doesn't require knowledge, just luck, instinct, or desperation. So the next time you see an image of a plague doctor in black robes, know this. He wasn't just a symbol of fear. He was a man walking through hell with a bottle of vinegar, a prayer, and a mask full of flowers. And somehow, sometimes, that was enough. Scalpel. Beneath the skirt. The girl wasn't supposed to be in the medical tent. She was too short, too quiet, too smooth-skinned to be a man. But her hands, they were fast, clever, steady. She cut with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times. No trembling, no hesitation. Only after the soldier survived, stitched, wrapped, and dosed, did someone notice. Under the blood-spattered tunic and the sweat-soaked bandages, she wasn't a he. She was a woman, and that was a crime. Let's open the case file of the forgotten female surgeons, the ones who dressed as men, trained in shadows, and cut under pseudonyms. This is the chapter history didn't just ignore, it actively buried. Because in medieval Europe, women weren't just discouraged from practicing medicine. They were forbidden, unless it was childbirth, or wound cleaning, or nursing. But surgery was sacred. Male, Latin, licensed, clerical. And so, to heal with a scalpel, a woman had to become invisible, or, more often, a man. We'll start with one of the most infamous and least confirmed cases, Johanna of Brabant. According to 15th century rumors, Johanna disguised herself as a young monk named Brother Simon. She trained in a monastic infirmary outside Liège and reportedly became one of the most skilled battlefield medics of her region. She was said to have amputated limbs with precision, developed a stitching technique using fish gut, carried opium-soaked cloths for battlefield anesthesia. One soldier allegedly whispered, mid-operation, "You cut like a mother." No one ever saw her hair, her chest, her face. Until one night, someone did. And just like that, she vanished from the records. No trial, no execution, just nothing. Only a note in the infirmary log. Brother Simon returned to God, reassigned to silence. Interpret that how you will. Now multiply that story by dozens. Because as we dig through medical records, battlefield reports, and burial ledgers, a pattern starts to emerge. Male names attached to handwriting that shifts mid-manuscript tools sized for smaller hands. Surgery kits hidden among women's belongings. Diagrams annotated in two voices, one stiff and Latinized, the other quick, lively, whispered in French or Italian. One surgeon in Milan was noted for having a delicate hand and a feminine air, until he abruptly disappeared after being summoned to court. Another in Prague was buried under a male name, but her bones told the truth. Female pelvis, female skull. Surgeons' calluses on the fingers. Let's talk logistics. How did they do it? Some bound their chests, of course, cut their hair, lowered their voices. But others went in plain sight, under protective status. Like nuns trained in convent infirmaries where medical knowledge was surprisingly advanced. Some convents had surgical wings. Some had their own anatomy texts, copied by hand, illustrated with anatomical drawings. They just weren't shared, because the world outside didn't want women cutting skin, only serving bread, bearing children, watching others die. There's a parchment, unsigned, dated 1431, found in a lockbox inside a nunnery in Bourges. It details a mastectomy. The patient, a wealthy merchant's wife. The surgeon, unknown. The writing is shaky, but vivid. The tumor moved like wax beneath the blade. The sister held her as she screamed. We gave her wine with poppy and whispered the psalm. After, we bled ourselves, so God would not punish the healing. They weren't allowed, but they did it anyway. because the alternative was letting her die. Let's not be naive. Some were caught, and when they were, the punishments were brutal. In Venice, a woman pretending to be a male surgeon was paraded through the streets in irons, her hands dyed red with paint, so all could see the sin she touched men with. In Rouen, a healer named Sabine was caught performing a trepanation, skull surgery, on a local official's son. She saved him, but they executed her anyway. Her body was burned, her name erased. And the boy? He lived to become a physician himself, but not all ended in fire. Some women survived by becoming legends. Take the mysterious Dr. Nicholas of Würzburg, a gifted surgeon, trained in anatomy, known for miraculous recoveries and unconventional techniques, including the first documented use of boiled linen as a wound sealant. After his death, when preparing the body for burial, attendants discovered Nicholas was not Nicholas. She was a woman, middle-aged, scarred. Pelvis broken at some point, likely from childbirth. Hands still stiff from years of stitching sinew and muscle. The church tried to suppress the discovery. But one monk wrote in his diary, "Her bones told no lies. Only her robes did." Here's where it gets chilling. Some female surgeons didn't disguise themselves at all. They simply operated in secret, outside the law, outside the church, in places where pain was the only authority. Underground birthing clinics, abortion houses, battlefield tents, plague houses. One such figure, known only as La Guérisseuse, ran a hidden infirmary in Lyon. No license, no protection. But stories say she removed bullets, amputated limbs, reset shattered bones. Men came to her when they were desperate, when the official doctors had failed. She never gave her real name, only asked, "Do you want to live?" And if they said yes, she cut. In some cases, their names were preserved, barely. In the margin of a 15th century medical codex, scrawled in red ink, "Claudia did this." They told her she could not. She did anyway. No last name, no location, just defiance. Just a mark carved into the edge of history. What does all this mean? It means that surgery didn't belong to men. They just kept it from women. Then watched in horror or awe when those women found their way back. Behind curtains, beneath robes, beneath skin. They weren't just midwives. They were cutters, stitchers, anatomists, healers. Not because they were allowed, but because someone was dying, and someone had to do something. Final story. A surgeon's kit was found in a grave in Austria in 1998. Steel tools. Delicate, worn, smooth from use. Alongside it, a small linen pouch, embroidered with a single initial, E inside it, a locket, inside that, a lock of hair, and a note. "For the girl who bleeds but does not break. May she always hold the knife steady." The body in the grave? Female. Estimated age, 42. Cause of death, unknown. Profession, according to archaeologists, surgeon. She held the scalpel. She wore the skirt, and she healed anyway. History didn't want her, but the wound remembers. The corpse beneath the kitchen floor. A creaking stair, a cold draft, a door hidden behind a shelf of dried onions and dusty wine bottles. Down the steps, darkness, and beneath that, a stone slab. Heavy, cracked, stained. They moved it and found a body. Not a murder, not a burial, an experiment. Because in the homes of medieval doctors, sometimes the kitchen wasn't just for soup. It was for anatomy. Welcome to the hidden world of anatomical theaters beneath private homes. Yes, theaters. Not public, not legal, but real, and all over Europe. Because while public dissections were rare, church-controlled, and bound in ritual, the real work, the experimentation, the discovery, the daring, often happened where no one was looking. Under the floorboards. Behind chapel walls. In cellars, where the candles never went out. Let's rewind. In the 14th and 15th centuries, universities began performing occasional dissections, but always under supervision, with a priest nearby, and a very limited scope. One body a year, if that. No women, no infants, no alterations to the curriculum. You could cut, but only to confirm what Galen had already said. You couldn't ask new questions. You couldn't point out mistakes. You couldn't explore. So some physicians, especially the more obsessive ones, decided, fine, we'll do it ourselves. One of the earliest known private dissectors was Antonio de Rossi, a Florentine physician with a reputation for excessive curiosity. In 1381, after the death of a plague victim in his care, he kept the body, not out of disrespect, but desperation. He couldn't understand why the man died. He needed to see inside. So he moved his kitchen table, tore up the stone tiles, and in the space beneath, created a slab of study. The first cut, he wrote, sounded like fruit splitting. The liver was black as pitch, the lungs soaked like drowned cloth. He documented everything. And when he was finished, he bricked the body into the floor, poured vinegar over the slab, and replaced the tiles. His wife never knew. Antonio wasn't alone. All over Europe, in Paris, Prague, Seville, London, there are scattered reports of strange smells from basements, of doctors with too much vinegar, of back rooms no one was allowed to enter. In one case, an apothecary in Ghent was arrested after his landlord found a preserved cadaver sitting upright in the wine cellar, eyes sewn open, mouth filled with herbs. He claimed he was studying speech. They didn't believe him. He vanished before the trial. The body was burned. What were they doing in these cellars? Everything they couldn't do in public. They dissected children, examined uteruses, studied the brain deeply, which was forbidden in most public dissections. They created diagrams never meant to be seen. One such sketch, found in a sealed jar beneath a convent in Avignon, shows nerve pathways that predate official discovery by 300 years. No author, no signature, just a symbol, a human skull pierced by an arrow, wrapped in vines. Historians call it the Vine Skull Codex. Some think it was a network, a secret society of physicians sharing notes, drawings, techniques, all outside the church's reach. Let's talk about the preservation methods. These weren't just cold, damp cellars. They were laboratories. Doctors used snow packed into floor pits during winter salt barrels, cloth soaked in vinegar and crushed herbs, early versions of alcohol immersion, often brandy, wine, or high-proof spirits, smoke curing, like meat, yes, they smoked corpses. One such anatomical ham room was discovered in Lübeck in 1937 during renovations. Inside, 3 preserved torsos hanging from meat hooks, perfectly intact. Circa 1470s. No records, no names, but on the wall, in Latin, "Do not enter if you are afraid to ask." And then there are the journals. Only a few survive, but they are harrowing. One, belonging to a physician in Krakow, is almost too clinical. Cut into belly at third candle, stench strong, worms visible in cavity, liver missing, possibly eaten, recorded signs of advanced internal rot, reconstructed stomach lining with wax for demonstration. Another from a surgeon in York is almost poetic. I opened the chest and saw the heart still clenched, as if unwilling to let go of its final breath. I whispered a prayer, not for him, for me, that I would understand what he could not tell me. Why go to such lengths? Because public medicine was a performance. But down in the cellar you could question, observe, discover. Be wrong. Be right. Be terrified. Be free. You could fail without being excommunicated. You could see things that contradicted sacred texts and write them down anyway. You could break open the rib cage and hear the echo of something no one had taught you, not because it was allowed, but because it was necessary. Of course, the risks were enormous. If caught, you could be fined, excommunicated, branded, imprisoned, or worse, declared a heretic. In Cologne, a doctor was found guilty of splitting the bodies of God's creations. They cut his hands off, hung his tools around his neck, and buried him face down, to silence his blasphemous gaze. There's a chilling case from Venice. A family home, passed down for generations, was being renovated in the 1800s. They tore up the kitchen floor. Underneath, a stone table stained. Beside it, shelves carved into the wall. On those shelves, vials, sketches, bones, and a letter, sealed in wax. In Latin, I have recorded what I could. The rest was too terrible. But I will not let the truth die beneath my house. If you find this, forgive me or don't. But read. Read and remember that the body does not lie. No name, but someone wanted us to know. Today we call these people criminals, desecrators, ghoul doctors. But if not for them, we might still believe the liver creates passion, that the womb floats like a ghost inside a woman's body, that the brain is just cooling fluid for the heart, because someone somewhere removed a kitchen floor, lit a candle, and cut open a truth no one else dared to see. Last fragment. In a cellar in Bruges, a wall collapsed during flooding in 1954. Behind it, a hidden door. Inside, a stone room, dry and cold, a slab, a lantern, a shelf with one jar. Inside that jar, a heart. Preserved in wine, floating gently, like it was waiting. On the wall, in rusty nails, he died in pain, but not for nothing. So the next time you hear footsteps above and feel the cold beneath your feet, remember, somewhere under someone's house, there may still be a body, not buried, not forgotten, studied, waiting to be understood. The cloth that bled and never dried. It hung in silence, a piece of cloth no longer than a scarf, browned with age, stiff at the edges, kept in a glass case in a monastery deep in the hills of Umbria. No labels, no fanfare, but the monks whispered about it. And once a year, on a particular night, they opened the case and found the cloth still wet. Not damp, wet, with what looked and smelled disturbingly like blood. No rot, no mold, no flies. Just the slow, sticky shine of a wound that refused to close. Relics are nothing new. From the earliest days of Christianity, pieces of saints were preserved, paraded, and worshipped. Finger bones, strands of hair, pieces of robe. They were tokens of holiness, fragments of divinity embedded in the world. But some relics behaved strangely. They bled. They wept. They radiated heat. They glowed. And some, like this cloth in Umbria, never dried. The Church, cautious but curious, kept these anomalies at arm's length. They didn't always investigate, but they never destroyed them either, because deep down, they weren't sure what they were dealing with. Let's talk about the Santa Lucia veil, allegedly stained with the blood of a martyr, and first documented in 1387. Every century or so, it would be tested, laid out in the sun, pressed with paper, locked in a dry box. And every time, the blood still shined. Doctors called it impossible. Priests called it holy. But one monk, in a now-lost letter, wrote, "We do not know what bleeds. It may not be the cloth. It may be the world." Of course, some claimed forgery. In 1452, an apothecary named Ludovico tried to replicate the weeping relic phenomenon by soaking linen in ox blood, mixed with myrrh and alum, and sealing it in beeswax. It looked convincing. It fooled several local priests until it began to rot. The smell gave it away. It blackened, curled, cracked. Not holy, just dead. And the real relic still sat in its case, still wept once a year, still refused to be explained. Let's go deeper. Some of these relics weren't just miracles, they were medicines. People believed that touching them could heal. Fevers, madness, tumors, blindness, infertility. And there are records, sworn testimonies, witnessed by monks, of people recovering overnight. A woman with a breast tumor pressed the cloth to her skin. The next day, the tumor was gone. Another, blind since birth, claimed she saw the light spill from the red thread. No evidence, just stories. But so many stories. Too many to ignore. Modern scientists, years later, were allowed to test one of these relics, the veil of Frosinone. A few threads, no destruction. The lab in Rome found no modern dyes, no detectable bacteria, no hemoglobin, strangely, but high levels of iron salts. The material wasn't standard linen. It contained traces of crushed murex, a sea snail pigment used in Roman times. In other words, ancient, untraceable, chemically odd. It didn't behave like cloth, it didn't behave like blood, but it looked like both. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because some of these bleeding relics weren't associated with saints. They were tied to sinners, heretics, executed midwives, women accused of abortion, necromancy, or unnatural knowledge. One such object, a strip of cloth said to belong to a woman burned in Toulouse in 1411. They called her Marta the Red for the color of her robes and the blood she supposedly summoned during a healing ritual. After her execution, someone retrieved the cloth from the pyre. It was burned, curled, half-crisped, and yet it bled. Monks buried it. 3 years later, it surfaced again in a convent 200 miles away. Still bleeding. No one claimed to move it. No one admitted they'd touched it. Theologians debated, was it punishment or proof of innocence? Was the cloth a scar or a sign? Because nothing else in the world behaves like that. And when you find a relic that won't rot, won't dry, won't stop bleeding, you have to ask what it's trying to say. Let's step into a herbarium in 15th century Naples. Among dried poppies and pressed sage leaves was a vial. Inside, a strip of ribbon, said to be dipped in blood during childbirth. Still red, still supple, still warm to the touch, according to a scribbled note. The midwife who owned it was accused of binding the wombs of unborn children. A spellcaster, a cutting woman. She was burned. The vial was hidden. Recovered by her apprentice, a nun. Preserved for over 300 years. And when opened again, still wet, still alive somehow. It's now in a museum in Palermo. Labeled, unknown organic artifact, possibly religious. But the real label, once attached to the cork, said, for pain, for power, for the ones who remember the cut. Skeptics will say it's all lies. Coincidence, freak chemistry, or long-lost embalming techniques. But explain this. In a Benedictine archive, there's a record of a visiting physician who tried to take a bleeding cloth for study. He cut off a corner, wrapped it in wax, left with it. 3 days later, he returned, pale, trembling. He gave the cloth back, said nothing, resigned from medicine the next month, disappeared from public record, except for one surviving letter. I thought I was studying a wound. I now believe it was studying me. And maybe that's the truth. Maybe these relics are wounds that the world never let close, memories in fabric, grief that hardened into ritual, power pressed into thread, and they bleed, because we keep cutting the same mistakes, century after century. Burn the healer. Silence the woman. Erase the cure. And the cloth. It remembers. It does not forgive. It does not dry. Final artifact. In 2009, a reliquary was discovered in a collapsed church in Umbria. Inside, a folded cloth, dried flowers, and a single line stitched into the fabric in hair-thin red thread. You burned my body, but not my medicine. No signature, no explanation, just blood. Still red, still soft, still waiting. The man who knew too much, they found his notes inside a hollow wall, wrapped in oiled cloth, bound with twine, pages dark with ink, and something else. Fingerprints, maybe. Or ash? And the first sentence? The body is not what they say it is. His name was Elias of Thorn, a nobody, officially. A traveling physician, sometimes called a barber surgeon, sometimes not called at all. But his patients, they whispered, about strange cures, about surgeries no one else could perform, about a man who looked into a dying child's eyes, touched her neck, and saved her without cutting, and about how, one day, he simply vanished. The church said nothing. The guilds said nothing. There was no investigation, just an empty room, a few broken vials, and walls that had once been shelves, scraped clean. But those notes, the ones hidden behind stone, survived. And what they contain is a different map of the human body. Elias wrote about things he wasn't supposed to see. He described the nervous system as a web of glass carrying light through the blood. He spoke of the liver not as a sack of sin, but as a filter of memory. He drew the heart, not symbolically, but with chambers, valves, and flow. And he described a pulse point behind the ear that could calm convulsions. This was the 1400s, before Harvey, before Vesalius, before the microscope. So where did he learn this? Some say he trained in Constantinople. Others claim he found Arabic manuscripts never seen in Europe. A few believe he had a woman teacher, long erased. But the most persistent rumor, that Elias had once opened a body that wasn't dead, and that it told him secrets no corpse should speak. His notebooks are filled with contradictions. In one passage he writes, "The spleen stores the sadness." In another, "Pain does not live in the nerves, but in the witness." He claimed that some wounds cannot heal unless the soul is addressed, that fear can scar the lungs, that shame makes the blood sluggish, and most strangely, that the body lies, but only when it wants to protect you. There's a drawing. Page 47. A cross-section of the brain, but not labeled like in other medical texts. Instead, he names parts: the chamber of regret, the gate of sleep, the hidden door. Beside it, a note: no blade can reach these, but words might. Why does this matter? Because after Elias vanished, others tried to replicate his work, and failed. They couldn't find the pulse point. They couldn't heal the way he did. They didn't understand his diagrams. It was as if he saw a different version of anatomy, one no one else could access. Not yet. In the last pages, his tone changes. He writes like someone being followed, watched. They do not want us to map the soul. They fear that if we understand too much, the power will shift. They want us to treat symptoms, not causes. And finally, if you are reading this, be careful what you heal. The wound is older than the body. What happened to Elias? Some say he fled to North Africa. Others think he was killed, not by the church, but by someone jealous of what he knew. There's no grave, no relics. Just a rumor that in a certain village, a century later, a child was born with a small red mark behind the ear, exactly where Elias found his mysterious pulse point, and that this child grew up to be a healer who never opened a book. only bodies. And always, only at night. So what do we make of all this? All the women who stitched in secret, the men who dissected beneath their kitchens, the bleeding cloths, the poison tonics, the stolen cures, the relics that never dried, the masked doctors who walked through plague smoke carrying bouquets of rosemary and fear, and Elias, who may have seen too much and vanished so we could remember. The story of medieval medicine isn't one of ignorance. Not really. It's a story of resistance, of people reaching through the fog of dogma and doctrine, trying to find the truth hiding inside our skin. It's about the fight to understand, and how dangerous that can be, even now, because we still punish those who know too much. We still look at the bleeding cloth and say, that can't be real. We still forget that every textbook is written on the backs of people who were once told, you must not know this. You must not ask that. You must not heal. But they did. And some of them are still bleeding through history, waiting, not to be believed, but to be heard.